In the Old West, the truth isn't always what it seems. Every story here is born of dust, loss, and revenge. I and voices of the Old West, and this is another scar etched in the earth.
The sun beat down mercilessly on the dry, cracked earth of Whistler's Creek, a town that hadn't seen rain in months. The wind whispered through the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and the bitter tang of human suffering. Jack Pharaoh Dunn, a cowboy who had become infamous across the land for his ruthless precision with a pistol, was close. He could feel it in his bones. The gang of outlaws he had been tracking for weeks was near. The promise of gold and revenge was all he needed to push him forward. But when he arrived at the rundown ranch of a small-time farmer, he wasn't expecting to find her. Ayanna, a woman of fierce eyes and quiet grace, a stranger in this harsh land. She didn't belong to the dust and the broken promises of the West. She was something else entirely, Native American, and yet she wasn't afraid to stand in his path. Her voice was steady as she spoke, each word carrying the weight of a past Jack couldn't begin to understand. She told him of the horrors she had witnessed, the massacre of her people by the same gang Jack was hunting, how her tribe had been destroyed, its women enslaved and sold to the highest bidder. But Jack wasn't interested in her plea for justice, at least not at first. His eyes were on the horizon, on the men who had taken everything from him. Yet something in Ayanna's presence made Jack hesitate. She was no damsel in distress. She was a warrior in her own right. And when Jack found himself in a deadly crossfire moments later, it was Ayanna who saved his life. That moment changed everything. As they rode together into the fading light of day, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this partnership wasn't just born out of necessity. It was something more. Something that could tear both of them apart or bind them together in ways they couldn't yet understand. But that would come later. For now, they had a common goal: to take down the gang that had stolen their futures, no matter the cost. Você DC 1 o ChatGPT DC Chapter 2. The next few days were a blur of dust and endless miles across the barren desert. Jack and Ayanna rode side by side, the silence between them thick with unsaid words. Jack's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, always watching, always alert. But his mind couldn't fully escape the woman riding beside him. Ayanna's presence gnawed at him, her strength and vulnerability wrapped into one, an enigma he couldn't quite untangle. It wasn't until they reached the dilapidated town of Whistler's Creek that things began to shift. This was the place where the gang was rumored to be hiding, and Jack's thirst for vengeance burned stronger than ever. But when he stepped into the saloon, the tension hit him like a punch to the gut. The noise of the place, clinking glasses, the shuffle of cards, and the loud laughter did little to mask the underlying tension. All eyes turned to them as they entered, and Jack immediately knew the people here weren't just simple folk. They were marked by the same desolation as the land. But Ayanna, her dark eyes calm and calculating, walked with the quiet authority of someone who had seen it all before. Jack couldn't help but notice the way the people responded to her. Some averted their gazes, while others regarded her with suspicion. It didn't take long for the bartender, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, to approach them. His eyes flickered nervously between Jack and Ayanna before he spoke in a low voice. "You two looking for trouble or just passing through?" the bartender asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "We're looking for information," Jack replied, his tone flat. "About the gang. We know they're here." The bartender hesitated. The room seemed to tighten, the air thick with unspoken history. "What makes you think they're here?" The bartender's voice dropped lower, as though he feared even the walls might hear. "I don't think," Jack said coldly. "I know." Before the bartender could respond, the door slammed open with a violent bang, and in walked Sheriff Tom Haskins. His eyes locked with Jack's, and for a split second, the air between them crackled with something old, something dark. A betrayal Jack had never fully processed until now. "Well, well," Haskins said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "If it isn't my old friend Jack Dunn, I should have known you'd show up here eventually." Jack's jaw clenched. The sheriff's presence was a reminder of everything Jack had lost, their shared history now tainted by secrets and lies. He had once trusted this man with his life, but that was before everything had gone wrong. "You've got nothing for me, Haskins," Jack said, his voice icy. Haskins stepped closer, the smile never leaving his face. "Is that so? You're treading on dangerous ground here, Jack. Best turn around and leave before you get yourself into something you won't be able to walk away from." Ayanna's voice broke through the tension like a cold wind. "You're with them, aren't you?" Haskins' grin faltered, but only for a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ayanna stepped forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You're as guilty as the rest of them. You helped slaughter my people, and now you're helping them keep their power." The room grew deathly silent. The bartender stiffened, backing away as Haskins's face darkened. Jack watched the exchange with growing unease, realizing just how much of the sheriff's corruption ran through the heart of this town. "Now, you listen here," Haskins spat, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what this woman has filled your head with, but you'd do well to forget it." Jack's hand hovered near his holster. There was a moment, just a fleeting moment, where he almost pulled the trigger. The old betrayal surged in him, threatening to swallow him whole. But before he could act, Ayana's steady hand rested on his arm, stopping him. "Not yet," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the sheriff. The sheriff gave a low chuckle, as if he enjoyed the tension in the room. "You've made a big mistake, Jack. This town is mine, and anyone who goes against me will regret it. That includes you and your little friend here." Ayana's gaze hardened, but Jack spoke first, his voice laced with venom. "It's not your town, Haskins, not anymore." With that, Jack and Ayana turned to leave, but the sheriff's voice stopped them in their tracks. "Don't think this is over," Haskins called after them, his tone dangerous. "I'll make sure you regret crossing me." Jack's eyes met Ayana's, both of them knowing that the game had just begun, and the stakes were higher than either of them had realized. End of Chapter 2. Você diz. 1 o ChatGPT diz. Chapter 3. The days that followed were filled with tension. Jack and Ayana made their way through the dusty streets of Whistler's Creek, always with one eye on the shadows, knowing that Sheriff Haskins wasn't a man who took kindly to being challenged. The unease in the air was palpable. Something about the town felt wrong, like a powder keg waiting to explode. Ayana, however, didn't seem worried. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to survive in a world far more dangerous than anything Jack could imagine. But Jack noticed how the people around them reacted to her, whispers, nervous glances, and the occasional stare full of hatred. This town was far from neutral when it came to outsiders, especially not someone like Ayana. They stopped at a small diner for a meal, the place as worn down as the rest of the town, and sat at the back corner, away from prying eyes. Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of every set of eyes that lingered on them. People were afraid of Haskins, afraid of the gang, and afraid of the changes that were coming. They had all learned to live under the boot of tyranny, and any threat to that order was something to be crushed. "What did you mean back there?" Jack finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. "When you said Haskins was involved with my family's death." Ayana didn't look up from her plate, but Jack saw the subtle tightening of her jaw. She took a long breath before speaking, her voice measured, but filled with an anger that she hadn't let him see until now. "Haskins helped the gang that killed your family," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "They were working together. He let them operate freely in this town. He was part of the deal. You see, the gang had connections with people who controlled much of the region, railroad tycoons, landowners. They wanted to take over everything, and your family's land was in the way. Haskins," he looked the other way, maybe even helped them along the way. Jack felt the sting of her words hit him like a physical blow. His family's death, his whole past, had been manipulated by the very man he had once called a friend. The sheriff wasn't just a corrupt lawman, he was a murderer in disguise. But Jack didn't have time for grief, not yet. The truth burned in him, but there were other things that needed to be done. He focused on the immediate task at hand, finding the gang and ending their reign of terror. Still, the truth of Haskins' betrayal gnawed at him, and he knew there would come a day when he would face the man again. And when that time came, Jack would make him pay. "I'm going to kill them," Jack muttered under his breath, his hand tightening into a fist. Ayana's gaze flicked up at him, and for a moment there was something softer in her eyes. Understanding, maybe even sympathy. She knew vengeance, perhaps better than anyone, but she also knew the consequences that followed. "Revenge won't bring them back, Jack," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You'll be consumed by it, and in the end, it'll cost you more than you're willing to pay." Jack looked at her, surprised by the tenderness in her voice. She was right, of course. He'd lived with revenge for so long that he hadn't really considered what it might cost him until now. "I know," he said quietly, his voice thick with frustration, "but I need to do this for them, for me." Ayana didn't respond immediately. Her eyes fixed on her food as if lost in thought. Finally, she sighed. "Then you'll need to be smart about it. And trust me, Jack, you're going to need help. This is bigger than just us." Jack met her gaze, a flicker of uncertainty in his chest. It had never been about the help of others. It had always been about him. But he knew now that Ayana had a point. They couldn't do this alone. And as if on cue, the door of the diner swung open with a loud creak, and in stepped a man who had clearly seen better days. His clothes were torn, his face grimy, but there was something in his eyes, a knowledge, a warning that caught Jack's attention. I hear you're looking for trouble, the man said, his voice low and rasping. Well, you found it. Ayana's hand instinctively moved to the revolver at her side, but Jack stopped her with a raised hand. This man wasn't an immediate threat. He was something else, something more. Jack could sense it. The man took a seat across from them without waiting for an invitation. You're after the gang, he said, his gaze flickering between the two of them. And Haskins. I've been watching you. Jack didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that trust in the West was as rare as water in the desert, but there was something about this man that seemed different. Who are you? Jack asked, his voice low. I'm someone who's been burned by the same people you're hunting, the man replied, and I've got information that could help you for a price. Jack's eyes narrowed. What kind of price? The man grinned, revealing a missing tooth. The kind you'll regret not paying. But I can make sure you get what you want. All I need is a little something in return. Ayana tensed beside Jack, but he held up a hand to stop her. We're listening, he said, his voice cold. The man wasn't the first to offer information in exchange for something, and Jack had learned to play that game better than anyone. End of Chapter 3. Você disse, o chat GPT disse. Chapter 4. The air in Whistler's Creek was thick with the promise of a storm, and Jack could feel it in his bones. The man who had sat down across from them, rough and ragged as he was, wasn't making idle threats. Jack had seen enough to know when someone was desperate. This stranger, with his missing tooth and eyes that darted around the room like a cornered animal, wasn't someone who gave up information freely. But the deal had already been set, whether Jack liked it or not. I know where they're hiding, the man said, his voice gravelly. He leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. But you'll need to move fast. The gang's planning something big, I can feel it. And Haskins, he's more involved than you think. Jack's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you know, and how much is it going to cost me? The man grinned again, a toothless, crooked smile that made Jack's skin crawl. I know where they keep their stash. Gold, weapons, the whole shebang. And I know where they're meeting tonight, but you're gonna have to get your hands dirty. Jack didn't flinch. He'd done worse things in his life, and he wasn't about to back down now. Go on, he urged, leaning in closer. The man glanced nervously over his shoulder, then leaned in, speaking in a whisper. They've got a safe house in the hills north of town. It's well guarded, but it's where they keep their supplies and their plans. You hit that place and you'll find more than just gold. You'll find everything you need to bring them down. Jack glanced at Ayana, who had been watching the conversation with a calm, calculating gaze. She nodded slightly, signaling her agreement. How do we know you're telling the truth? Ayana asked, her voice low but firm. The man didn't hesitate. I'm not stupid enough to lie to people like you. You want to take down Haskins. You want to kill the gang, and I want to see them burn. We're all in this together. Whether you trust me or not, you're going to need this information. Jack stared at the man for a long moment. He could see the desperation in the man's eyes, the fear of being left behind or worse, abandoned by both sides of this war. There was something about his desperation that Jack understood. They were both searching for something in this godforsaken town, something that had been taken from them. Jack stood up, his hand tightening on his holster. He wasn't about to let this opportunity slip away. All right, Jack said, his voice cold. We'll do this. But if you're lying, I'm not lying, the man interrupted quickly. You'll find everything you need at the safe house. But be careful. There's someone inside working for Haskins. Someone who won't hesitate to send a bullet your way. Jack's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He could handle it. He had to. Ayana stood, her movements graceful and precise as she adjusted her gear. We leave now, she said simply. The man rose from his seat, giving them one last wary glance. You'll need a few more men if you plan on taking them down. It's not just about guns, it's about timing, but I'll leave that to you. But just don't take too long, those bastards are always one step ahead. The town was already slipping into dusk when Jack and Ayana mounted their horses and rode out. The wind howled across the desert, carrying with it a sense of inevitability. Jack couldn't help but think of his family, of the ghosts that still haunted him in the darkest hours of the night. The world had taken everything from him, but this was something he could take back. As they rode through the barren landscape, Ayana glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You know this isn't going to be easy, right? She asked, her voice steady. I've never expected easy, Jack replied, his voice hard. But it's the only way forward. Ayana fell silent, but Jack could tell she was processing everything. She had her own demons, her own battle to fight. They were both too far gone to ever return to who they had been, but together, they might just find some kind of redemption. The hills loomed ahead of them, the darkness now almost swallowing the landscape. The safe house was near. Jack could feel it, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. This was the point of no return. When they arrived at the base of the hills, The moon was just a sliver in the sky, offering little light. They dismounted and made their way on foot, silent as shadows. Jack's senses were heightened. Every noise, every crack of a twig had his hand hovering near his gun. Ayanna moved beside him, every step purposeful, her eyes scanning the darkness. They reached the entrance of the safe house, a small, weathered building at the edge of a clearing. The windows were dark, but Jack could hear the faintest sound of voices inside. He motioned for Ayanna to stay back, his instincts telling him to scout the area first. She nodded without question, knowing that Jack's expertise was in moments like these. As Jack crept closer to the building, he could hear muffled voices, a conversation, too soft to make out. He signaled to Ayanna, who moved toward the back of the house to keep watch. Jack, taking a deep breath, crept closer to the door. He could feel his pulse quicken as he reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. Jack turned the handle slowly, every muscle in his body taut. He swung the door open just a crack, enough to peer inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were 5 men in the room, but one of them wasn't a stranger. Sheriff Tom Haskins was sitting at the head of the table, a stack of papers in front of him. His face was lit by a single lantern, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he processed the sight. Haskins had been working with the gang all along, and now he was orchestrating something bigger than he had realized. The truth had just gotten darker. End of Chapter 4. Você diz? 1. O ChatGPT diz. Chapter 5. Jack stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. As he peered through the crack in the door, the shadows inside the room seemed to stretch and pulse with a sinister energy. Haskins, the man who had once been a trusted ally, now sat among the outlaws, his presence as much a betrayal as the bullet that had killed his family. Jack's fingers tightened around the handle, a cold rage filling him. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment where everything he had fought for would either be claimed or lost forever. Through the dim light, Jack could make out the figures of 4 men seated around a table. Haskins sat at the head as if he were the leader, directing the movements of the gang with ease. His voice was low but authoritative, and Jack could hear the words that confirmed his worst fears. "Tonight, we move," Haskins said, a wicked gleam in his eye. "The payoff's big. We'll have the whole territory under our thumb before the week's out. Those women, we'll ship 'em out to the east, make ourselves a small fortune." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He had known the gang was vile, but hearing it from Haskins's own mouth made it real. The corruption ran deeper than Jack had imagined. It wasn't just about territory or money. It was about breaking people, destroying them in ways that left no trace but blood. Ayanna's face flashed in Jack's mind. She had been fighting for more than just revenge. She had been fighting for her people, for a future that wasn't built on suffering. Jack's hands clenched into fists. He had come to destroy the gang, to take down Haskins and all those who had wronged him. But now, standing in the shadows, he realized the battle was no longer just for justice. It was for the very soul of the land. He took a step back from the door, silently motioning for Ayanna to move into position. They would need to be smart about this. A direct attack would be suicide, but they couldn't let this moment slip away. Ayanna appeared from the shadows, her movements silent and fluid. She didn't ask questions, didn't need to. She knew what Jack had seen, and together they were going to finish this. "Get to the back," Jack whispered. "We'll catch them from both sides." Ayanna nodded, her face a mask of determination. She disappeared into the night, moving swiftly toward the rear of the building. Jack took a deep breath, letting the silence of the desert wrap around him like a shroud. He was no stranger to danger, but the coldness in his chest now was different. It was the weight of everything he had lost, everything he had sacrificed for the pursuit of vengeance. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. Jack slowly crept toward the door again, slipping inside with the skill of a man who had spent his life navigating the shadows. The creak of the hinges was barely audible, and he slid into the room, staying out of sight. The men at the table were too focused on their plans to notice him. He moved to the side, positioning himself near a stack of crates, hidden from view but within reach of his gun. His pulse thrummed in his ears as he watched Haskins, the man he had once trusted, lean forward and pull a map from the table. "This is where we strike," Haskins was saying, pointing to a marked location. "The woman won't know what hit her. She's got a price on her head, and it's about time we collect." Jack's heart froze. The woman. It could only be Ayanna they were talking about. She was the reason they were all here. The reason he had taken up arms against a town that was now as corrupt as the gang itself. Jack felt his blood boil, a fire igniting deep within him. This wasn't just about revenge for his family anymore. It was about saving Ayanna, about stopping this madness before it could destroy any more lives. In the silence of the night, he heard the unmistakable click of a gun being drawn. Ayanna had positioned herself at the back, and now it was time to make their move. But before Jack could take the first step, the door slammed open. A shadowed figure stood in the doorway, blocking the light. Jack froze, knowing instantly it was too late to retreat. "Seems we've got company," the figure said, his voice low and mocking. Haskins stood up, his hand on his gun. "What the hell is this?" Jack done. The tension in the room escalated, the air thick with impending violence. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as Haskins sneered. "I should have known you'd be foolish enough to follow me," Haskins said with a wicked grin. "You've always been a pain in my side, Dunn, but now you've crossed a line." Jack didn't flinch. He was done with playing games. The time for talk was over. "You should have stayed out of this, Haskins," Jack growled, his gun already in hand. There was a moment of stillness, the calm before the storm. The four men at the table reached for their weapons, but it was too late. Ayanna had already moved into position, her figure silhouetted in the doorway behind them. She didn't hesitate. Her revolver cracked in the night. The first shot a warning to the gang. The men froze, their hands hovering over their holsters as the tension skyrocketed. Jack didn't wait for them to make a move. He drew his pistol, his aim sharp and true, and fired. The first bullet found its mark, taking down the closest man to him. The other three scrambled for cover, but the fight had already begun. Gunfire erupted in the small room, chaos breaking loose as Jack and Ayanna moved with deadly precision. Haskins shouted orders, but the noise of the gunfight drowned him out. The men didn't stand a chance against the two of them. The years of pain, of loss, surged to the surface as they fought side by side, each shot a release of everything they had carried with them. When the smoke cleared, the room was eerily silent. The gang was dead. Haskins lay on the floor, blood pooling around him, his face contorted in shock. Jack stood over him, his gun still aimed at the man who had once been a friend. His heart was pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The revenge he had sought for so long was finally in his grasp, but there was something else now, something darker. "You did this," Jack spat, his voice a cold whisper. "You and your gang. You took everything from me, from Ayanna, from us." Haskins didn't answer, his eyes wide with fear. Jack's hand shook slightly as he aimed the gun at the man's chest. But before he could pull the trigger, Ayanna stepped forward, her hand on his arm. "Jack," she said softly, "let him go." For a moment, Jack didn't move. The anger was still burning in him, a fire that hadn't been extinguished by all the blood that had been spilled. But when he looked into Ayanna's eyes, something shifted. The rage wasn't the answer, not anymore. Jack lowered his gun. "You're lucky," he muttered, turning away from Haskins. "This time, you're lucky." End of Chapter 5. Vose dis. 1. O ChatGPT dis. Chapter 6. The sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the walls was the only thing that filled the room after the gunfire had stopped. Jack stood there, his hands still trembling slightly from the violence of the past few moments. He had expected a rush of triumph, a sense of satisfaction, but instead, all he felt was emptiness. The fight was over, but the war within him still raged. He turned to face Ayanna, whose face was as calm as ever, though Jack could see the weight of everything they had just done in her eyes. She was a warrior, always had been, but there was a difference between fighting for survival and fighting for vengeance. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice soft but firm. She knew him better than anyone, knew what that moment had cost him. Jack didn't answer right away. He couldn't find the words. The rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow feeling that gnawed at his chest. Had he truly done the right thing? Or had he just crossed another line that he couldn't return from? For so long, vengeance had been his only drive. But now that it was over, he wasn't sure what came next. Ayanna seemed to sense his turmoil, and she stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "We've taken down the gang. Haskins is dead. Your family. They can't be brought back. But at least the men who did this are gone." Jack nodded, but the words didn't seem to reach him. The weight of it all was too heavy. He'd thought killing Haskins would set him free, that it would erase the years of pain and loss. But instead, it felt like there was still something missing, something deeper that he couldn't quite name. He moved toward the door, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. Ayanna followed him, and together they stepped outside into the quiet night. The air was cool now, the dust settled, and the moon cast long shadows over the land. "I need to see it," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see the land, the place where it all happened, where they took everything from me." Ayanna didn't question him, she knew exactly what he meant. They rode out into the desert together, the stars above them more brilliant than ever. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but comfortable. Jack's thoughts were clouded, but Ayanna's steady presence was grounding. She had her own pain, her own scars, and yet here she was, strong, resilient, and unwilling to let the past completely destroy her. They arrived at the place where Jack's family had once lived, where the fields had been green and the house had been full of life. Now it was just a shell, a broken structure with memories that had long since faded. Jack dismounted and walked toward the remains of the house. The wind stirred the dust, but everything else was still. The land had been scarred by fire and violence, but even now there was something beautiful in the emptiness. It was hard to describe. A part of him wanted to feel anger, but instead, all he felt was grief. "I never thought I'd come back here," Jack said, his voice thick. "I thought I could forget about this place, thought I could outrun it." Ayana stood behind him, watching him closely. "You can't outrun your past, Jack. No one can. But you don't have to let it control you either." Jack turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know if I can live with it, with all of it. The killing, the blood, the rage." Ayana stepped forward, her eyes steady. "You've carried it for so long, but it's not who you are. The man I see now isn't the man who was driven by revenge. You've changed, Jack, and you've given me a reason to believe that we can change this land too." Jack looked out over the barren landscape, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. For the first time, he wondered if there could be a future beyond all the pain, beyond the death and destruction. "What happens now?" Jack asked quietly. Ayana's gaze softened. "Now, we rebuild, together." The silence that followed wasn't empty, but filled with the unspoken understanding between them. The past might have been ugly, but it was behind them, and in the distance the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. Jack looked at Ayana, a sense of peace settling in him for the first time in years. She had been his anchor in the storm, the only one who understood the weight of what he had endured. And now, as the sun rose, he realized something he hadn't known before. Redemption wasn't just about seeking justice for the past, it was about choosing to move forward. With Ayana by his side, Jack felt a small spark of hope, one that had been buried for far too long. They turned their horses and rode off together, the desert stretching out before them, a land of broken dreams, but also perhaps a place where new ones could begin. End of Chapter 6. Vosidis 1. O ChatGPT Dis. Chapter 7. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Jack and Ayana made their way back to town, the desert stretching out behind them like a vast, unforgiving sea of dust and rock. There was an undeniable change in the air, a shift that neither of them could name, but both felt deep inside. They had done what they set out to do. They had struck down the gang, torn apart the very heart of the corruption that had poisoned this land. And yet, for all the bloodshed, the violence and the vengeance, the road ahead was still unclear. They reached Whistler's Creek just as the town was beginning to stir. The first few souls emerging from their homes, eyes wary but expectant. The streets were as barren as ever, the buildings standing like silent witnesses to years of hardship. Nothing had changed, not really. The same dust clung to the corners, the same silence hung in the air, but there was a difference, something faint, almost imperceptible. The town had tasted freedom, however brief, and for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of possibility. Jack and Ayana dismounted in front of the saloon, where the barkeep, the same man who had been so reluctant to speak with them just days ago, now watched them carefully, his eyes flicking from Jack to Ayana. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," the bartender said, his tone cautious but not hostile. "I reckon the sheriff's not going to be a problem anymore?" Jack nodded, his face grim but resolute. "Not anymore." The man hesitated, looking at them both. Then he seemed to make a decision, one that spoke volumes in a place where trust was a luxury few could afford. He turned and gestured for them to follow him inside. "Come on in. I've got something for you." The saloon smelled of stale whiskey and old cigars, the air thick with the ghosts of long-forgotten deals and broken promises. As Jack and Ayana stepped in, the few patrons who had begun to gather for the morning stared at them with a mixture of curiosity and fear. The fight might have been won, but the scars left behind would take longer to heal. The bartender led them to the back of the saloon, where a small weathered chest sat atop a barrel. He motioned for Jack to open it. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a collection of papers, old deeds, handwritten documents, and a few scraps of maps. Jack's brows furrowed as he lifted them, feeling the weight of the history contained in the worn paper. "What's this?" he asked, looking at the bartender. The man sighed, his weathered face showing signs of regret. "These are the deeds to the land, Jack, your family's land. It's been in the hands of those bastards for far too long, but I've got it back. It's yours again." Jack stared at the papers, a mixture of disbelief and sorrow rising in his chest. For years he had fought for a piece of land that no longer seemed to matter, not after everything he had lost, but holding the deeds now felt like the weight of the world had been placed back in his hands. "Why?" Jack asked quietly, his voice rough. "Why help us now?" The bartender gave a short, hollow laugh. "You did what no one else was willing to do. You took on the gang and you took down Haskins. You've given people like me a chance to breathe, to live. This town, it's been held hostage for far too long." Ayanna stood beside Jack, her eyes steady as she studied the papers. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a quiet urgency in her words. The bartender looked down at the chest, then back up at them. "Now, you have a choice. You can leave this place behind, ride off into the desert, and never look back. Or you can take the land, rebuild it, do something good with it, help people. It's up to you." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He had always thought he would leave once the gang was dead, once Haskins was gone. There would be nothing left to keep him here. But now, standing in this room with the land his family had once worked, it felt like the weight of 1,000 possibilities was staring him in the face. For the first time in a long while, Jack didn't know what to do next. "I never thought I'd come back here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not after everything." Ayanna turned to him, her face softening with understanding. "But maybe that's what this land needs. Someone who's seen what it can become. Someone who knows how to fight for it." Jack looked at the chest, at the faded papers that represented both a past he had longed to forget and a future that was now within his reach. For so long, he had believed that vengeance was the only path forward. But as he looked into Ayanna's eyes, something inside him shifted. She had helped him see that there was more to life than revenge. Maybe there was something left worth saving after all. "We rebuild," Jack said, his voice steady with resolve. "For them, for everyone." Ayanna nodded, her face glowing with quiet pride. "Then, let's start." As Jack and Ayanna walked out of the saloon, the town seemed a little less heavy. The wind had shifted and there was something new in the air. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was hope. And hope, Jack realized, was something he hadn't felt in a long time. They rode out together back toward the land that Jack's family had once tended, the place where it all began. They didn't speak much on the way, but the silence between them was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with possibility. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a golden light over the desert, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was running from his past. He was walking toward the future, a future where he and Ayanna would rebuild, not just the land but the lives they had lost, together. End of Chapter 7. Vosidis 1. O ChatGPT Dis. Chapter 8. The days that followed felt like a blur of hard work, long hours, and quiet reflection. Whistler's Creek, despite its history of corruption and bloodshed, began to take on a new form. The streets, which had once been filled with tension and fear, now seemed to carry a whisper of hope. But Jack knew that the road to healing would be anything but smooth. Rebuilding wasn't just about laying new foundations, it was about restoring trust one piece at a time. Jack and Ayanna spent their mornings working on the land, clearing away the remnants of the destruction that had once consumed it. They built what could become a new life for themselves, and as they worked, the land, once barren and broken, began to show signs of renewal. The soil, though scarred, responded to their efforts. It was as if the earth itself was listening, and for the first time in years, Jack felt a faint stir of something resembling peace. By day's end, they would return to the small cabin they had built together at the edge of the town, where they had started to carve out a life for themselves. The work was grueling, the days long, but there was something steadying in the rhythm of it. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a constant reminder that despite the darkness of their pasts, there was still beauty in the world. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch of their cabin, his gaze fixed on the land stretching out before him, Ayanna came up behind him, her steps soft on the dirt. The weight of the day hung in the air, and for the first time there was no need for words. They had both settled into something new, a rhythm, a partnership, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something lingering between them. "For your quiet tonight?" Ayanna remarked, her voice breaking the silence. Jack glanced at her, his eyes heavy. "Just thinking. I never thought I'd be back here working this land. It doesn't feel real." She sat beside him, her gaze following his toward the vast stretch of land that they had begun to shape. "You've spent so much of your life fighting, Jack. Fighting for revenge, for survival. Maybe this is what it's all been for." Jack shook his head, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know if I can ever leave all that behind. It's not easy, you know. Letting go of the things that have driven you." Ayanna's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jack could see a reflection of his own struggles in her. She had her own battle to fight, one that wasn't just about survival, but about reclaiming something she had lost long before she had met him. Her tribe, her people. She had been through so much, had seen so much loss, but through it all, she had never once allowed herself to become consumed by vengeance the way he had. "The past doesn't have to define you," Ayana said, her voice low, but filled with a quiet strength. "We can choose what comes next. It's hard, but we get to decide." Jack met her gaze, something in him shifting, something he hadn't known was still there. He didn't have all the answers. He might never have all the answers, but in that moment, he realized that maybe that was okay. Maybe it wasn't about fixing everything, but about moving forward, no matter how broken the road might be. "Maybe you're right," Jack said, his voice rough but sincere. "Maybe we don't have to let all of it weigh us down." Ayana smiled, a rare softness touching her features. "We can't erase what's been done, but we can make a future worth fighting for." As the night descended, the stars twinkling above them, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. Ayana was right. They could rebuild. Not just the land, but themselves. Their pasts would always be a part of them, but it didn't have to be the part that defined them. The next morning, Jack woke early, as he always did, and stepped outside to find Ayana already working the soil. She was determined, focused, her movements graceful as she prepared the earth for planting. Jack couldn't help but admire the way she worked, how her quiet strength had become the bedrock of their new life. He joined her, the weight of the day's work ahead of them not seeming quite so heavy anymore. They had a purpose now, a direction. It wasn't the life Jack had imagined for himself, but it was a life nonetheless, a life that they were building together. And as the sun rose higher, casting its warmth over the land, Jack felt the first true stirrings of peace in his heart. The land was theirs now, and so was the future. It would take time, a lot of time, but the pieces were finally starting to come together. As the days turned into weeks, the town of Whistler's Creek began to change. The people who had once lived under the shadow of fear and tyranny began to find new hope. The saloon, once a den of corruption, was now a gathering place where the townsfolk met to share news, to rebuild, to start again. For the first time, Jack felt like he was part of something larger than himself. It wasn't just the land he had reclaimed. It was the people, the community that was beginning to trust again. They had all been scarred by the same darkness, but now they were standing in the light together. Jack and Ayana knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, and perhaps even more pain to come. But they also knew that they didn't have to face it alone. Together they could build something worth fighting for. End of Chapter 8. Você disse, Wando Chat GPT disse, Chapter 9. It had been nearly a month since Jack and Ayana began working the land together, and the transformation was palpable. The cabin had become their home, not just a shelter from the storm, but a place where they could breathe, where they could begin again. The town of Whistler's Creek was still recovering, but there was a quiet optimism in the air now, a feeling that hadn't been there before. Jack's days were spent working alongside Ayana, restoring the farm, tending to the crops, and making repairs to the land his family had once owned. The work was hard, but it was honest, and every night as they sat together on the porch watching the stars paint the sky, Jack felt something he had almost forgotten, the weight of contentment. It wasn't the same as revenge or anger. It was a different kind of peace, one that didn't come from killing or violence, but from creating something new. But just when it seemed that they were beginning to settle into a new rhythm, trouble found them once more. It came in the form of a familiar face. Jack had been in town, gathering supplies, when he saw him, a man he never thought he'd see again. Eli Turner, a former member of the gang, stood in the middle of the street, his rough features twisted with uncertainty. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Turner had been one of the men who had helped tear his life apart. The last time Jack had seen him, he had been running with Haskins, helping to carry out the horrors of the gang's rule. Turner had always been a shadow in Jack's past, a figure who had escaped his vengeance because Jack had never been able to track him down. But now here he was, standing in the middle of the street like a ghost from another life. Jack's hand instinctively went to his holster, but before he could move, Turner spotted him. He froze, his face falling as if he'd been caught in a trap. "Done!" Turner called out, his voice rough, hoarse. "You're alive!" Jack didn't answer at first. He studied the man in front of him, trying to read his face, wondering what he wanted, what he had come here for. Part of him wanted to pull his gun and be done with it, wipe out the last of Haskins' crew, take justice into his own hands. But another part of him, the part that Ayana had helped to awaken, knew that it wasn't that simple anymore. "Why are you here, Turner?" Jack's voice was low, dangerous. Turner glanced around as though trying to figure out how to explain himself. He shuffled his feet, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. I didn't come to fight, Turner muttered. I came to make things right. I came to apologize. Jack's eyes narrowed. Apologize? You're a little late for that, don't you think? Turner winced, but didn't back down. I know what I did. What all of us did. I was just following orders, but that doesn't make it right. I want to help. I want to make things right. Jack took a step forward, his hand still near his holster, but his instincts told him to hold off. You want to help now, after everything? I don't expect you to forgive me, Turner said, his eyes filled with regret. But I can help you. I know where the rest of the gang is hiding. I know the routes they take. I can help you finish what you started. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken history. Jack could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, the memories of the past clawing at him, but Ayana's voice echoed in his mind. We can choose what comes next. Why should I trust you? Jack asked, his voice still cold, but there was something else beneath it now. A curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the weight of the choices that lay ahead. Turner hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. Then he spoke again. Because I'm tired of running, I'm tired of hiding. I want to fix what I've broken if you'll let me. Jack studied him for a long moment. He knew better than to trust anyone so easily, especially someone who had been part of the destruction of his family. But this was different. Turner was no longer the same man he had been back then. He was broken, desperate for redemption, and Jack could see it in his eyes. You've got one chance, Turner, Jack finally said, his voice hard, but not without a trace of something else, something that resembled a second chance. One chance to prove you're not the same man you were. Turner nodded quickly, relief flooding his features. Thank you, I won't let you down. That night, Jack and Ayana sat on the porch of their cabin, the sky stretching out before them in a blanket of stars. Jack stared into the fire, his mind racing with the unexpected turn of events. Turner, a man who had once been his enemy, was now an ally. The world had changed so much in such a short time. Ayana sat beside him, her presence grounding him. She didn't say anything for a while, content to let Jack think through the weight of the decision he had just made. Finally, she spoke, her voice gentle but firm. You did the right thing, she said, her eyes meeting his. You're giving him a chance. We're all capable of change, even him. Jack didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure yet if he had made the right choice, but he trusted Ayana. She had been his rock through everything, and if she believed in this, maybe he could too. I don't know, Jack admitted. I want to believe he can change, but sometimes it feels like I'm just letting the past come back to haunt me. Ayana placed a hand on his. The past will always be with us, but we don't have to let it control us. Jack looked at her, his heart full. She was right. The past was always going to be a part of him, a part of them, but it didn't have to define their future. They had a future now, together, and that was all that mattered. End of Chapter 9. Você diz 1. O ChatGPT diz, Chapter 10. The next few days felt like a strange balance between uncertainty and progress. Jack had made his decision to give Eli Turner a chance, but it wasn't without its challenges. The man who had once been a part of the gang that tore his world apart was now offering his knowledge in an attempt at redemption. Jack didn't know if he could trust Turner fully. He didn't know if anyone could, but he had to give the man a shot. The gang's remnants were still a threat. Even with Haskins gone, there were pieces left scattered across the land, criminals who needed to be rooted out before they could cause any more damage. Turner had given them the location of an old hideout, a place where the remaining members of the gang were holed up. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jack and Ayana set out early one morning, the air crisp and cool as the sun broke over the horizon. The journey to the hideout took hours, winding through the desolate stretches of land Jack had come to know all too well. The ride was silent, both of them lost in their thoughts. Jack's mind kept returning to Turner. Could he really be trusted? And more importantly, could he live with himself if he let Turner slip back into old habits? When they reached the outskirts of the hideout, a dilapidated barn surrounded by dried-up fields, Jack motioned for Ayana to dismount. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the air. This was the kind of place where people hid when they had nowhere left to run. Jack could feel it in his bones, the danger, the desperation that still lingered here. They moved cautiously toward the barn, their horses tied out of sight. Jack's instincts were on high alert, his every sense heightened. Ayana followed his lead, her movements quiet, fluid like the hunter she was. They reached the barn, its wooden frame sagging, barely standing. Jack pushed open the door just enough to peer inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The place was empty, empty, except for a few scattered crates and a dust-covered floor. But there was something off about it. The air felt too still, the silence too thick. "Stay close," Jack whispered to Ayanna. They stepped inside cautiously, their boots muffled against the dirt floor. The barn's interior was dim, the sunlight filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls. The stench of old hay and the lingering scent of sweat filled the air. The place felt abandoned, but Jack knew better. They were being watched. Before Jack could make another move, the sound of a footstep behind him broke the silence. He spun around, his hand already on his gun, but instead of an enemy, it was Eli Turner, his face a mix of nervousness and determination. I thought I'd come help," Turner said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been here before, they won't be far, I can help you." "Stay back," Jack cut him off, his voice sharp. "This is my fight. You stay out of this, we're here to finish what we started." Turner nodded, stepping back a few paces, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I'll keep watch outside." Jack didn't take his eyes off Turner as the man stepped away. He didn't trust him, not yet, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As Turner disappeared out of sight, Jack and Ayanna continued their search. They moved deeper into the barn, their every step calculated, listening for any sign of movement, and then, as if on cue, the silence was shattered by a loud crash from the back of the barn. Jack's hand flew to his pistol as he sprang into action, but it was too late. The trap had been sprung. From the darkness, a group of men appeared, guns drawn, the remnants of the gang. Jack's heart sank as he recognized the familiar faces, men who had been loyal to Haskins, men who had once been his enemies. "Thought you could just walk in here and take us out?" one of the men sneered, his gun aimed squarely at Jack. "You're too late, Dunn. This time it's you who's dead." Jack's eyes flicked to Ayanna, who was already calculating their next move. There was no way out. The odds were stacked against them. They were outnumbered and they couldn't afford to make a mistake. "We'll see about that," Jack muttered under his breath. Before he could make his move, one of the men fired a shot. The bullet grazed Jack's arm, causing him to stagger back. Pain shot through his body, but he didn't have time to process it. He was already drawing his own gun, returning fire with deadly precision. Ayanna was beside him in an instant, her revolver blazing, the shots ringing out one after another. The fight was brutal, quick and chaotic. Every shot seemed to echo in the barn, bouncing off the walls, adding to the deafening noise. Jack's heart raced as he moved swiftly, his hand steady as he fired at the men closing in on him. Ayanna moved like a shadow, her movements swift and calculated, taking down their enemies with precision. But just as it seemed like they were gaining the upper hand, a man lunged at Jack from behind, knocking him to the ground. His gun skittered out of reach. The man's fist came down hard on Jack's chest, knocking the air out of him. Ayanna shouted, but Jack could barely hear her over the ringing in his ears. He struggled beneath the man, pushing him off just enough to grab his knife from his belt. With a swift motion, Jack drove the blade into the man's side, ending the fight in an instant. Breathing heavily, Jack pushed himself up, his body sore, his mind racing. The remaining men had either fled or been taken down, and the barn was now eerily quiet once more. Ayanna rushed to his side, her face full of concern. "Are you all right?" Jack nodded, grimacing at the pain in his arm. "I've had worse." Ayanna helped him to his feet, her touch gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, Jack, you never did." Jack looked around the barn, at the destruction they had wrought, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. The battle was over, but the war, his fight for redemption, for peace, was far from won. And though they had taken down one more piece of the gang, Jack knew there was still more work to be done. "I know," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, "but we'll do it together." End of Chapter 10. Você diz 1. O ChatGPT diz, Chapter 11. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when Jack and Ayanna made their way back to Whistler's Creek. The day had been long, and the fight had been even longer. The barn had been cleared, the last of the gang members either dead or scattered, and the air now felt a little lighter, but there was no sense of triumph in Jack's chest, only weariness. Ayanna rode beside him, her horse steady under her, though Jack could see the tension still lingering in her eyes. It wasn't just the physical wounds they had both sustained, it was the emotional toll of everything they had been through, the cost of the choices they'd made. "I thought it would be easier," Jack said, his voice raw, his eyes trained on the path ahead. "But even after all of this, it doesn't feel like we've won." Ayanna didn't respond right away, her gaze far away, as if she too was considering the same question. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "You can't erase what happened, Jack," she said. "You can't undo the past, but what you can do is choose what happens next. That's the victory. Jack glanced at her, her words sinking deep within him. Ayanna had always understood things in a way that Jack never quite could. She saw the bigger picture, the long game. He had been so focused on revenge, on making them pay for every wrong that had been done to him, to his family, that he had forgotten there was another way to look at things. The future, he murmured, almost to himself. What comes next? It wasn't a question, more of a realization. He'd been living in the shadow of the past for so long, drowning in it, but there was more ahead of him. There had to be. The land was his, the town was his, and, most importantly, he wasn't alone anymore. As they neared the edge of town, the familiar outline of Whistler's Creek came into view. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the glow of moonlight to guide their way. The town was quiet, but something in the air felt different, calmer, even though the scars of the past still ran deep. Jack had started to realize that peace wouldn't come in one fell swoop. It wasn't about wiping the slate clean, it was about finding a way to rebuild from the ashes. They rode into the center of town, where a few folks were lingering outside their homes, looking up at them with hesitant, uncertain eyes. Jack didn't know what they saw in him, what they saw in both of them, but he knew that this was just the beginning. Jack dismounted, feeling the weight of the long day in his bones. He winced slightly as he touched his injured arm, but he didn't let it slow him down. Ayanna was already walking toward the saloon, and Jack followed her, the two of them moving in sync. There was no need for words. The path forward was clear now. Inside the saloon, the few patrons who were left looked up at them. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thick with the history of the place, but tonight felt different. There was no unease, no tension, just a quiet acceptance, like the town had finally made peace with what had happened. The bartender, who had been a quiet ally during their mission, nodded at them from behind the counter. "You did it," he said simply. "You finished it." Jack didn't reply at first. He walked past the bar, his eyes scanning the room. There was still a lot to be done. The town had been torn apart by fear, by greed, and by the men who had tried to control it. But there were people here, people who had stayed and fought through the storm. And there was a chance, just a chance, that this town could be rebuilt into something better. "I don't know if it's finished," Jack said, his voice thick, "but it's a start." Ayanna stood beside him, looking around the saloon with a quiet satisfaction. "That's all we can ask for, isn't it?" Jack glanced at her, her face.
When the smoke clears and the bodies fall, only silence remains. If this story touched you, subscribe, because in the West, nothing stays buried for long.